Well, good evening and welcome to another episode of Inuka Afrika. Today we'll be looking at the role of education within society, particularly within African societies, with a view to development and how our educated elite, especially, are playing a role, if at all, in Africa's development, or if they realize the factors at play, particularly after independence. Have they just taken over managing what was left behind? Or do they have new perspectives and solutions for Africa? Joining me is Francisca Mandeya, who will be helping me explore that aspect. Welcome, Francisca, to Inuka Afrika.
Thank you, September.
Now, in terms of education, in education we inherited in Africa and most African nations, particularly after independence, what can you say about the systems we inherited?
The systems we inherited, according to what I know, are systems that were designed for the colonizers to advance their social, political, economic goals or objectives. Freire would say the banking type of education, particularly when it comes to education, where the teacher has the knowledge and the student is the recipient, passive recipient of knowledge. We experienced that in school. We had a curriculum. It was a Cambridge curriculum. It came from the United Kingdom, designed there, examined there. When we got to be independent, we inherited that system. When we changed it, we crafted it around the same colonial system.
Now, you mentioned the banking model of education. Could you describe that for our viewers so that they have an understanding of what the banking model is of education?
So it's like when you go to a petrol station and the petrol attendant pours fuel into the tank. So the teacher is like the petrol attendant pouring knowledge into it. And he or she is the one that is the repository of knowledge, and students are passive. And what they're expected to do is to absorb that knowledge, repeat it, and write an exam and pass. And they then are ready to serve in the market and advance the interests of the economy for those who are leading. So in simple terms, that's the banking type of education. The student doesn't question. The student is not creative. They know nothing. They only know what the teacher teaches them.
Okay, so it's like rote learning, right? Where they replicate and memorize what they've been fed.
Yes.
So from my understanding of what you've said, then the systems we inherited after independence, it seems there was an imperative to decolonize education systems. Would you agree with that statement, that there was an imperative to decolonize education systems?
I think the intention was there. I do not have the details. But of course, from the changeover that was done from the Cambridge system to the ZIMSEC system, I think I was in the stream where we started having half our papers being marked in Zimbabwe and half our papers being taken to the UK for grading. So there was that intention to decolonize and to be self-reliant in terms of education, at least from my experience.
Yeah. Now, I think even before we go to decolonization, when we were colonized, the education system that we're receiving, what was it meant to achieve? Can you just give a brief background of what it aimed to achieve in terms of the African that was going through being educated through this system?
So the African that was being educated through the system was supposed to pass their exams, get ready for the job market, and serve the economy. They were not educated to own. They were educated to serve the economy. And so you would find that some would occupy positions in the corporate, but of course, most of them were the preserve of the ruling class, which was white people. The rest of the Africans were just operating in the capacity as servers of the economy.
Okay, so they was just supposed to fit into the system and keep the wheels turning within the system. Yes. That was their primary role.
Yes.
No, it's interesting. Now, I don't know if you can also explain in terms of indigenous knowledge systems in this type of education pre-independence. Would you say they were integrated into the curriculum or they were marginalized?
I speak from a very limited position. What I noticed happening is that the will to indigenize the education system was there. But what we failed to do was to recognize that the system as it was set up was not designed for the African to prosper. And therefore, if we replace, let's say, history, the history that we're being taught, European with African, and the African kind of history is history that was written by the European, not written by Africans from their standpoint. We have not decolonized, we have not liberated ourselves because we are still using materials and curriculum were designed to serve the colonizer, allow me to say that. So there was no in-depth change, or what can I say? The intention was there, but the depth in terms of decolonizing and indigenizing was not deep enough because it was a question of replacing one thing with the other. But do we have our own systems truly integrated into the education system? In my experience, no, I haven't seen that.
Okay, someone else might say education is education. Africa had African doctors, African teachers, African lawyers. Therefore, that's a success story of some type. And decolonization may not have been required. What would you say to that kind of argument?
I would ask them, what is there for the show that we have educated lawyers, doctors, PhDs currently if education is meant to liberate us and to humanize us, what is there for the show in Africa to show that we are educated? That's the question I would ask them.
Now, you mentioned also that education is meant to liberate us. Can you explain further how does education, how would it liberate someone?
Education would liberate someone if it allowed them to exercise freedom, to question the status quo, and to come up with solutions to make sure that people are humanized, people meet their fundamental human needs, and we live according to our values of Ubuntu, seeing each other as humans and making sure we take care of each other. That is what would happen if education is liberating people. On the other end, if I may say, if education is not liberating people, it's domesticating them. It means that we are educating our children to toe the line and to agree with what we think and how we are doing things socially, economically, politically, and we domesticate them. Like we're trying to indoctrinate them so that they agree with our ways, even if our ways are not leading to any socio-economic or political liberation.
Yeah. Now, if I understand you correctly, you kind of answered one of my questions as saying Africa has got nothing to show for its so-called education. There's underdevelopment, and in fact, in most African countries, we've gone backwards with dilapidating infrastructure, which is now worse than during colonial times. To me, that seems like our ruling elite and the ruling class and the educated class do not understand or have the capacity to challenge systems, either of oppression or systems that don't help us develop. How would you kind of counter or disagree or agree with that kind of assertion?
So we are part of that system. I just want to own my part that I'm educated in Africa. I have 2 degrees, but I'm not in Africa right now. That says a lot about us as a people, that we have some of our best brains serving the colonizer in the Western world. And so that's problematic. We are not liberated. Even as we have this conversation, I feel like that. And then that educated elite have failed to decolonize because they are dependent on global institutions, financial institutions, where they borrow money on our behalf to better our country. We are in so much debt, but there is nothing for the show. So for me, the question is, if we are educated and we've been doing this for the past, I don't know, in some African countries, but in some for the past 40 years, some for the past 20 years, 30 years, post-independence, how come as Africans we do not recognize that we are in a debt trap and we are in an ideological trap where we are caught in a system that is the antithesis of who we are, of Ubuntu. We are caught in a global political economy that is the opposite of who we are. So how come as Africans we have not figured that out?
Yeah, I think you bring a very valid point, and I'll start by making a statement as well that I've heard around that our elites have been unable to challenge the status quo, which is something we inherited from colonialism. We haven't been able to move forward. And in terms of how we educate ourselves, we go and get educated overseas or wherever, and we come to manage the legacies of colonialism instead of uprooting them and changing them.
Yes.
And our leaders have become gatekeepers for the colonialists. Would you agree with that kind of perspective?
I want to refer to Moletsi Mbeki, who says most African leaders are pseudo leaders. They are managing capital for the real leaders of this world.
Okay.
Yeah, so why do I say that? I see the way we beg for money in foreign countries, and we send money when people invest. Most of them that even invested, the rich people, their money is not in their country; it's in the global capitals, or the global capital cities, and that says a lot about us as a people. So I think I lost my train of thought there. But we have no faith in our own system, and we have failed to extract ourselves. So the question becomes, if our leaders run to beg for money, for loans, and yet Africa is where all the wealth is reposed, how do we explain that? We are rich yet poor. They should be coming to us, not us going to them. I think that's where I was going with this question. So something is not right in the power dynamics and in the way we think as Africans. I remember when I was doing some studies in development studies, and we had an argument about what Africa should do. We talked about delinking. Let's delink, disconnect from this global community and look inward. Let's serve each other first with our resources. Like, make it count, because we have everything we need. Because if the world looks up to us for resources, surely we can look up to ourselves or into Africa and ask ourselves, what does each African nation need, and serve each other before we allow the colonial powers to continue extracting and exploiting our motherland.
From what I'm hearing, there seems to be a serious lack of solutions from Africans, including the so-called educated elite.
Yes, now, it is true.
What kind of shift would be required for them? I know you've mentioned delinking, and I think China did that successfully. Because if you look around, Africa does not own anything. They are happy even internet and infrastructure being owned by someone else.
Or contracting Chinese engineers to come and build roads and stadia for us. Do we not have Zimbabwean engineers? Exactly. Why don't they form an association where they do nation building and get all that money that we are giving to foreigners?
Exactly. Now, what would be required to kind of change that mindset?
It's liberation of the mind, going back to education. What kind of education are we exposing our African children to? Freire would say education needs to be problem
solving,
posed. Yeah, you use the problem posing kind of method where we have a myriad of problems, but let's just take one and get people to talk about it. Have a dialogue, not just talk. Dialogue about it. That means looking at the social, economic, political. We can put legal, environmental, and all other factors, but social, political, economic will cover all the aspects that need to be covered. Go deep into the analysis of this problem.
Mm-hmm.
Not only analysis, but get critical analysis, and then come up with solutions. Solutions will come from the people. Trust that the people have knowledge, not book knowledge, but knowledge of experience, knowledge from books, knowledge from interacting with each other. They will generate solutions. But they have to feel strongly. What is lacking is passion and love for Africa, right? The passion and love for Africa. We know the problems, but what we lack is enough love for us to sit down and to revamp the way we talk about things, the way we do things, which is our education system, and then come up with actions that will lead to change. Now, these actions can be dangerous.
Yeah.
We were talking to Joan from Kenya, and the mass movement, the critical mass that they managed to cook up in Kenya and staged a protest against something that they didn't desire. We have to get to a level where we are all critically conscious and we all agree that change might need a critical mass. But how we get there is if our why is strong, if we feel strongly about the need to really change the way things are and challenge systems, political, with respect, non-violently, but to say, for our generation, it's not working. In our father's generation, the struggle worked, they had guns. We are not going to take guns and fight our parents who are in leadership in Africa. But if we could have a platform where we can dialogue around Africa and have no guns, no police, no soldiers, but talk about development and challenge the elders and get knowledge from them. We lack that love. Yeah. Sorry, okay. I don't know if I'm answering your questions properly.
Now, therefore, would you think that someone would say education does not need to be decolonized because we're now independent? Now, what does, in your view, decolonization of education look like in terms of the student-teacher relationship in Africa? What would it look like?
The student-teacher relationship must be that of dialogue, where the teacher does not know everything. They will be there as both a teacher and a student. And also the student is not just a passive learner. They are active in having a dialogue and also teaching the teacher. When they come up with solutions, the teacher is going to be surprised. I didn't think about that. There are students that are more brilliant than teachers the world over. So if we have that dialogical encounter of teaching and learning at the same time, and really focusing on what is the problem that Africa needs to solve. If we have that dialogical encounter intergenerationally, our fathers who are in the 80s, who are mostly the leaders in Africa, and the younger generation of leaders, and also just the ordinary people across generations, have a dialogue to say what would make Africa work, what works for us. If we have education systems where we have such exchanges, we would come up with rich solutions, both from the old and the young.
Okay, so in terms of what you've described and explained just now, it appears that the system of rote learning, or the banking model, as you called it, is not desirable, as it does not inspire critical thinking among the students.
No, it doesn't.
Could you explain that further? What would we mean by critical thinking, etc., and how would it benefit finding solutions?
So critical thinking. I like talking about critical consciousness. Yeah, because it allows the student to examine the contradictions in the economy, in the political economy, and look at the social, economic, and political situation that is causing their poverty or their undesired reality, and be able to understand through dialogue what is at play, socially what is happening, economically what is happening, politically what is happening. When they have a deeper understanding and they locate where the problem is, then they will engage in critical actions to uproot that problem. So that is what I mean by critical consciousness. It's posing a problem there, getting people all, what do you call it? I don't want to say hyped up, galvanized into action based on the strong feeling or strong love they have for all people to be equal, to access their human needs and have dignity. So it is that critical consciousness that Africa needs, and it comes through dialogue. We have to dialogue, and what we dialogue about must be relevant. How do we know that it's relevant? It's if you ask someone, let's say in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Botswana, what is the problem that you're experiencing? If the problem is the same throughout those countries, then you know it's an African problem. So that's how you know, okay, everyone is feeling angry about whatever issues happening in Africa. That's how you know this is what should be discussed. And then you have tools for social analysis, socially, economically, politically, and then they digest that in a dialogical manner and they come up with solutions.
Yes. Now, I'm going to move a bit and take a practical problem from South Africa. We've heard of that there are high levels of xenophobia, and some people have come outright and said that's not xenophobia. It's more Afrophobia, because it's only Africans that are targeted by South Africans and not any other race. Now, would you relate to the type of education that was received as well? Why would a fellow African particularly direct this kind of anger, saying you are not South African, you're coming to take our jobs, etc., but just targeting to, this is targeted towards Africans more, and then some people calling it Afrophobia more than xenophobia. Would you say that's part of the education we received as way of divide and conquer that also needs to be decolonized, so to speak? Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah. I think I'm more agreeable with Afrophobia, where we hate ourselves. We hate each other so much. There are no or few white people experiencing the kind of violence that we have seen unleashed on fellow Africans by South Africans in South Africa. And it's a shame because our countries, we owe our countries' names to the colonizer. They divided us up once we were one. So it's a shame for us to actually believe in these countries and their names. And it's not African to do that. That tells you something. The division that happened as a result of colonization and what else?
Well, you're talking about the Berlin Conference, or
the Berlin Conference, when Africa was cut up, right?
Yeah.
That is a colonial project, right? And we got our names, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, from people scrambling to own us, but we were once one. Even though we had distinct identities within the African diaspora, we were one people with our own issues. I'm coming back to the education system. Sorry about that. We were taught to hate ourselves. When the colonizers came, they brought the Bible and the gun, and they wiped out everything that we knew about ourselves by demonizing it. This is wrong. The people that you worship are wrong. Your complexion is inferior. All the things that the colonizer came with to Africa to strip us of our identity, to hate ourselves. It's now manifesting in how we treat each other as Africans. So at least that's from my experience and what I think, my opinion, and part of what I've read. And I strongly believe that the stealing of our identity through introduction of other cultures like Christianity, that were a strategy to get what was underneath our ground. That I can confirm because I wrote about it in Searching for Racial Equality. And I know it from King Leopold's letter, that the colonizers' mission was to occupy themselves with what is under our ground.
Yeah.
So, yes, I agree. It's Afrophobia. We hate ourselves. It's by design, but we cannot keep saying the same thing over and over without breaking the cycle. So it's on us. We know, we talk about it, we hate each other because of ABC. We know the root causes. What is the action that we are taking to make sure that as Africans, we don't keep on doing that?
So is that where critical consciousness would come in?
Yes.
And what does critical consciousness look like, if you were to describe it in terms of what needs to be done and how you view things, etc.?
For me, there needs to be Ubuntu education, a return to Ubuntu. That would fast track critical consciousness, like consciousness about who an African is. It's returning to Ubuntu. Then we'll be rooted in our identity. And so we don't have any doubt as to who we are. So we are grounded. So when you know who you are, then you are likely going to be guided in terms of what actions you can do and you cannot do. It's an African to light a human being, use petrol and light a match and watch a human being and inhale their smoke, watch them dying and screaming. It's an African. We have departed from Ubuntu. So we need to take those actions of Afrophobia, pose them to Africans, and get them to think, is that African? Who is really taking your job? We need a dialogue, a well-crafted dialogue where there's no blame, shame, or guilt tripping, but to say, this is what we do to each other. What are the root causes? The social, the economic, the political.
I think you've touched on someone when you raised the issue or the question as some form of discussion about who is taking your job. I think it leads to the question that this borders or drives towards empowerment and on looking at problems in a deeper way than overquoting it and kind of following the differences that have been highlighted by the colonizers before, if I may call them that.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of empowerment, would you say Africans are empowered as citizens as well?
I don't want to judge here, but there should be indicators for empowerment. And normally these indicators, you see them in basic needs being met. You see them in freedom of expression. You see them in infrastructure, like roads. You see them in peace, and especially when people express themselves. So I don't know which African country enjoys that for the most part.
Now,
empowerment?
Yeah.
Maybe a few. I wouldn't want to paint a picture that is bleak for Africa.
Yeah,
some are. some are not. But when I get back to for me, my criteria is Ubuntu. Are we being Africans? Are we empowered as African children? And then we go to the value system that Ubuntu is all about. Using that criteria, we are not empowered. We are not ourselves. We're not honoring who we are. We are living according to the dictates of other people's identity and culture.
Yeah, when you mentioned, I think you touched on what I was going to ask next in terms of when you mentioned identity. Would you say part of decolonizing the education system is moving away from a Eurocentric focused learning system that prioritizes European histories and knowledge systems? Because basically that's what colonial education did to us. It prioritized European histories and education systems, very little of African history.
Yeah.
Would you say that's would be part of decolonizing?
Yes. Center Africans in their own development.
Yeah.
Center them in education. Center them on the global arena. The African must think about Africa first and not serving other people. The African must be aware that Africa is rich and not go about begging like poor people. Yeah. It's a mindset. We are not poor.
Yeah.
We are just poorly managed.
Yeah. And you mentioned something critical, indigenous knowledge systems, and you mentioned Ubuntu. And I think that would be required as well.
Yes. Yeah. Our ancestors knew the land. Our ancestors knew preservation. Our ancestors knew about the environment. But how we are being presented to the world now is like, we don't know how to conserve. We don't know how to do this. We need to change that mindset and go and ask the elders that are still there now how they related to the land, how they went to ask for rain. That is a contested belief system, but believe me, they used to go to and ask for rain. Certain trees are not cut, and all the things, the sacred things. We need to go and ask them because there's something in there, but we were just told that everything is nonsense and evil. And that is the African problem. And that's the African curse, that we hate everything that is ours. But it can come back packaged in a Eurocentric way. They love our mbira. I play mbira. Look who has made the most money from mbira. It's not Africans.
Yeah. Now, would you say Ubuntu kind of fits perfectly well in encouraging critical consciousness? By that I mean, is Ubuntu by nature dialogical in its approach to issues?
We made a blend. I will not say I'm an expert of Ubuntu, but I think by virtue of recognizing the humanity in each other, that says a lot. It's about dignity. It's about love. It's about respect. So when we have love and respect, we can engage in a decent dialogue. I'll give an example about gender dynamics. The gender template that we are using now is not African, where women are disrespected. I've heard people say this, people with more knowledge in terms of the African way of doing things, but I know it from being a woman myself, and I know from researching that men respected women. And in terms of dialogue, a lot of chiefs I heard, they would say, I will go and ask the ancestors about a decision. And guess who they were consulting? Their wives. I also heard that when people were about to go to war, they just didn't go to kill. they would ask the mothers and the grandmothers, tell them that they are going to war, and they would be told how to go and behave while at war. So ask me about Ubuntu, it had that regard for the feminine. You look at this current global system, it does not have regard for the matriarch or the feminine. And this is why we are soulless as a globe now, because there's no respect for the mother, for the women.
So as it stands now as well, taking into account Ubuntu, taking into account the system we inherited, the educational system we inherited, it would appear that we've maintained an education system that prepares individuals for the workforce, but does not foster critical thinking, civic engagement, and social justice. In this aspect, would you conclude that in some instances, or in most instances, we are still not liberated, we're still domesticated? If we're kind of following a situation where we can't pinpoint, identify our problems, and provide solutions.
Yeah, we are very much domesticated. We are operating within a system that convinces us that being individualistic and personal success is more important than communal success. And that is a disaster. From an African perspective, that is a disaster.
Yeah.
Because if you win and I don't win, we have not won from an African perspective. But according to other cultures, if one person is a billionaire and another one is dirt poor, that's okay. And it has crept into our African culture. We now have such people.
Yes.
Who are filthy rich and others are dirt poor.
Now, what would a liberating educational system in Africa look like? What would you say would be the end result? What I know you mentioned some approaches, how if we were to have a liberating education, we would think of development, and you suggested delinking, etc., and looking inward, and you suggested returning to the values of Ubuntu. Is there anything else that you'd kind of advise or suggest immediately? What else? Because I'm sure most people are still grappling with the idea of what a decolonized education system looks like. Yeah.
I think this is a decision that Africans have to make collectively. If I stood here and I said I have all the solutions, I would be very, I don't know, arrogant and un-African. Because I will come back to say I've shared what I know, but we would sit down as Africans. The first thing is gather around the fire and talk about what it is that we feel strongly about as Africans. Have a group of people. We can't do it as a whole billion people. Have a group of people that have the heart for community, that are pan-African, and deliberate the issues that Africa is grappling with. And come to an understanding of the whole social, political, economic factors at play.
Yeah.
And after that, find a way of getting everyone else engaged in the conversation, in the dialogue, and have ways of making sure that all voices, including the marginalized, are heard. That is African. Have safety nets to take care of the vulnerable now. We have rich people in Africa. I guess they are trying their best. But are we doing the best that we can to look out for each other and look out for the vulnerable now? It can be daunting to do it as one person, because I could be doing something to help someone in Africa right now.
Yeah.
And you could be doing it. But what if, as a collective, we came up with a way to stay our own and stop receiving aid from people who say they mean well, when we know that their help comes with conditions? There is enough Africans in the diaspora to mobilize help for our own without any conditions. But we are not together.
Yes, I think this lack of togetherness is also reflected in the divisions between Anglophone-speaking Africans, Francophone-speaking Africans, Spanish-speaking Africans, Portuguese-speaking Africans.
Yeah.
Now, as an African who comes from Southern Africa, would you think I should be interested in something that's happening in the Sahel region, for instance, in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali? Would that show if I'm interested in their problems to the south? Or because I was talking to someone and they said, I'm not interested in what's happening in West Africa. I've got my own problems in my country. How would you fit that all in as an African who is a critical thinker?
I think to say I'm not interested in what is happening in another part of Africa speaks to how we have been educated to focus on ourselves as individuals and to focus on our own lives. I will not judge that person. Sometimes the world's problems can be too daunting for anybody to want to be everywhere. It's not possible. But some of us, we come from Southern Africa. We even go outside African interests. We are supporting what's happening outside our culture, or rooting for social justice outside our culture. We do not have to belong to that culture for us to say we want social justice in the world. So that speaks to the selfish nature that has been cultivated through this education system that says if you are number one, it begins with the positions number one or A+, and this, it grades us and pits us against one another. And I've always said such an education system is problematic because we are competing like with unlike. No human being is the same. And so if you're going to judge me based on a certain criteria and I'm not good at that, you are writing me off as a potential contributor to society based on a criteria that's wrong for me. So we have such an education system that says, oh, who's number one this term? It's so and so. So they focus on the best student. They don't focus on the person that's at the bottom of the class, or they ridicule them. That is problematic. So we get our self-centeredness embedded in the education system. So I don't care about the person that is number 52. If I'm number one, I'm the best.
Does this not spill over to the ruling elites who are so-called educated, that after independence, they've assumed the position of the previous rulers whom Africans saw as oppressors, and they've themselves now become oppressors? If they're not, is this not a reflection of that education, or is it not, or is this just being
it is a reflection of the system that when we think we are educated now, because we were educated on their values. So everything we do, we mimic the oppressor. Because if it was our Ubuntu values, we wouldn't have people flaunting wealth and doing all sorts of funny things that are selfish, amassing wealth while others are languishing in poverty. So it speaks to the system, like you rightly say, the system of the oppressor, and we are mimicking that oppressor, and the dehumanization in that system shows in how we are conducting ourselves. We are okay with flaunting wealth, while others are languishing in poverty. And we say to them, you are poor because you are lazy. That's the colonizers' language. No, they are poor because the whole system, social, political, and economic, does not provide them equitable opportunities to become who they are meant to become.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, and in terms of governance, how does education contribute to good governance? This I'm asking with perspective that most African countries inherited unjust systems. How does education impact social justice?
That's not an easy question to answer.
Yeah.
I would try my best.
No, that's why.
Yeah. So how does education contribute to social justice? Again,
I think you touched on it when you mentioned the selfishness of people, etc.
Yeah. Again, I would say what type of education? If it's the humanizing kind of education, where you are taught to love other human beings, that every human being deserves a dignified life. And a dignified life means that they must have basic human needs: water, food, clothing, a good education, and the higher needs, housing, like shelter, and even self-actualizing. We should be able to talk about that as human beings. So education helps us to be aware of what other humans deserve, and it can only go as far as we apply it, because we can learn it in the books that it is someone's right to do A, B, C, D. That is book education.
Yes.
Right. But there's another type of education that must happen: education of the heart. And again, I will default to Ubuntu, because it teaches a person to see the humanity in another. Meaning, you will value human life before all else, including wealth. So in terms of prioritizing, you would know, because your heart of Ubuntu is telling you another person needs you. They need their rights taken care of. Now, in this world, like I said, we are in a world where say, they don't have food. It's not my problem. So you can actually walk past someone who doesn't have food and say it's not your problem, because the system has educated you to say, as long as you make it, the other people that are not making it, it's their own business. So there has to be another type of education that educates the heart. Teaching people to have empathy, to get into the shoes of someone and feel it. It's very scarce, that kind of education.
Yeah, and it's good that you mentioned that, because the basic premise for Ubuntu is I am because you are.
Yes.
Yeah, which is
empathy embedded.
Yeah, exactly. Now, it's interesting. It's been an interesting discussion. In conclusion, then, how would you summarize what we've been discussing? I think here you can maybe explain in summary any steps, if there are any steps, whether there needs to be a mindset shift, and in understanding the problems, and education being liberating or domesticating. Maybe explore those further, but in summary, as we conclude, and what Africa needs to, what you think Africa needs to do to move forward in changing its mindset.
So what I have learned about education is there's no education that is neutral. education must really be pointed towards a certain objective. So we cannot lie that I'm just teaching my child this because I want them to be like a neutral person. There's nothing like that. We educate for a reason. And so that's one of Paulo Freire's principles. No education is neutral. If you're educating either to domesticate or to liberate. So we have to ask ourselves, the current education systems in Africa, are they designed to domesticate us into the status quo or to liberate us from our poverty? Number one. Number two, we can talk about relevance. Is the education relevant? How do you know? Is it speaking to our desires, to our passions as Africans? We have to ask that. Are the degrees and the curricula that are being offered in schools relevant to solving our current problem? Right? And then, are we dialogical in nature in our education? Is there room for intergenerational dialogue between the ruling class, which are mostly our fathers' ages, and our children now, who are young adults? So is there a dialogue where the elder can agree that they don't know everything, they can be taught by the youth, and the youth can agree that they don't know everything and they can be taught by the elders, and we can build Africa? Right. So those are a few of the principles. I would just pose them as questions. But for me, I think if we had such a healthy system of education where we allowed all people involved, because we are talking about the future. The future is not us. Even us, we are grandparents now. We are not the future anymore. We have children and grandchildren. So we have to involve those that will be custodians of Mother Earth when we are gone. There is something that is problematic in an education systems that thinks our children are still children. No, they are now parents. They're carrying the future as we speak. And so our education must recognize that richness within our culture. And what I encourage Africans is to have dialogue, not to just argue, but to have dialogical encounters where we learn, we unlearn, and we relearn. We relearn Ubuntu, we unlearn colonization, and we decolonize. Yeah. So for me, I mean, I can't claim that I know everything. I'm just speaking from the heart. But I feel like we need to tap into the love that is embedded in our culture through Ubuntu. We need to return to Ubuntu and be in action, not have talk shows. What are we going to do after this dialogue? Some of us have been writing books. Some of us have been creating programs to make sure that we are operating at that level where we feel for each other. Mentally, there is a lot of damage that has been done to Africans. Do we have places where we take care of our mental health so that we are able to work for ourselves, our communities, and our country and our continent from a healthy mindset? There are a lot of actions Africans could be doing, but the one thing that I would love to see is more platforms for dialogue like this one, but at a continental level, where like-minded people who are passionate for Africa meet and not have talk shows, but have dialogues that can help to create solutions for Africa. I know they are there.
Thank you very much, Francisca, for that. You've heard it. We're discussing education this evening and being able to find solutions for Africa. And on closing, just a word from myself. We've been getting aid for many years in Africa, but we haven't seen the development. So we've got to understand the issue at hand of getting aid, but no development. We've been getting loans from the IMFs, no development. Is it part of our education that we cannot identify even the help we are receiving As a problem, I think Francisca mentioned critical consciousness, which is what I leave you with tonight. Have a good evening, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.